Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about monetary policy and why the way we think about interest rates doesn't really work correctly and why that's a ticking time bomb. But at the end, I'm going to tell you guys like how what you can actually do because like we aren't the Federal Reserve, we don't set rates. Like how does understanding this stuff help you? Like how can you apply these principles to earning money and improving your life? So I'll cover that at the end. But first, let's talk about raising interest rates. So, the way I describe it, and I cover this a lot on my Substack newsletter, ratedisparity.substack.com. Basically, the premise is the same way people earn different wages when they work, like, not everyone earns the same wage. It makes sense that financial assets should not earn the same amount, and we should not expect them to earn the same amount. We shouldn't expect every bond a country issues, every stock or security to earn the same amount. Whereas standard economic theory is based on the idea of equilibrium, that investments will adjust so that all investments make a comparable risk adjusted rate of return. Now, the variable that forgets about is how passive or active an investment is. So, if you have influence over an investment, then you can earn more. If you just passively get money from owning stuff, I consider that negative taxation. It's like feudalism. Just because your name is on a title, you receive payments from the public. So, the public defines who owns what. It may be based on ethical principles like the idea that you should be entitled to what you work for, but ultimately the public grants or recognizes property rights. And so if you have your name on a title or a piece of paper, and just because of that you get stuff regularly, that is a form of negative taxation. So that's the first principle we're talking about. That passive interest income is negative taxation. It's money you get just for owning stuff, just for what I call the privilege of title. And interest rates, it doesn't make sense to have them all the same or in equilibrium any more than it would make sense that everyone earns the same wage. Neither of these ideas are really logical. That's my basic starting premise. Okay, now on to interest rate setting. So the idea is that central banks adjust interest rates according to inflation. Now, their goal in this, the paradigm that is currently used, is that when there's inflation, the real interest rate, which is adjusted for inflation, goes down so that people will want to short a currency, and essentially you'd want to short a currency, which means bet that it'll go down even more. So basically the paradigm is that anytime a currency value goes down, because that lowers the real interest rate, all of a sudden no one will want to save the currency and all that stuff. So it's like a spiral effect. That's sort of like the mainstream concept. What this ignores is that when assets go down in value, they then become a bargain buy and they can rebound. So when there's inflation, that like naturally lowers the national debt, the real value of the national debt, these kind of things. So there's then potential for rebound. So inflation doesn't have to be accelerating. And when people short sell assets, they actually help find the bottom price where it can start going up again sooner. So they help it bottom sooner. So we shouldn't necessarily be worried about inflation. It's a correction to market prices that needs to happen. So again, there's a lot that goes into it. I could talk about fiscal theories of inflation. I could talk about MMT, John Cochrane, I think maybe is how you say it, has his own fiscal theory of inflation, which is he has a debt valuation equation, which is based on the valuation of the national debt. It's like the primary surplus or the present value of future primary surpluses. It's an interesting concept. I don't necessarily agree with it so much because of the way it defines primary surpluses or whatnot. So there's a lot that can go into this. But to make a long story short, when inflation is high, then they raise interest rates high. They really want to take care of people who are saving the currency, using the currency as a store of value. They want to make sure the real interest rate is always positive. Now, if we did the same for workers, it would mean whenever there's inflation, we want to make sure we raise wages real quick, otherwise workers will stop working. That's the exact same logic, except they apply it to people who own assets. They say anytime there's inflation, we want to make sure that people who own assets are still compensated fairly. So we raise interest rates so that they keep earning a fair amount on the capital that they own. And the express idea is actually to punish people working so their wages are suppressed so that brings inflation down. So the logic of inflation fighting we currently have is that's accommodate people who own assets, that's make sure the real rate stays high, that's punish people who are working, that's keep their wages down so that fights inflation. So it's sort of an unbalanced approach. It favors people who own assets. Now, there is a caveat to that in that if you own outstanding treasury debt and they raise rates, then that existing debt gets devalued. So the outstanding debt, the debt that has already been purchased, loses present value, but moving forward, people earn more on the debt. So there's a little caveat. Some people who own assets do lose value when they raise rates, but mostly it's to protect people who can earn money from owning assets. And they are so super aggressive. The economic theory is so aggressive about this that Argentina has had nominal interest rates over 100%. So basically, you are doubling your money every year, and that is supposed to fight inflation. Like, when the interest rate is 100%, then every year your money gets doubled. And if you're doubling money, you have more of it. And they're trying to use this to fight inflation. It's totally crazy. It's totally ludicrous. And it's all about protecting the incomes of people who own assets because they're so frightened that if people who own assets don't want to buy your asset, then it'll ruin you. And they don't take the same logic to people who want to work, when you could equally say, well, if there's inflation and then the real wage comes down, then we want to make sure people are getting paid, so we keep people working. So it's just about accommodating one group over another. But so you could take the attitude, let's have a permanent zero interest rate, and MMT suggests that. I think they make good arguments for that. I don't think we need to go to that extreme, basically. So my paradigm is set the nominal rate as if it were the real rate. So if on a credit card you might have an interest rate of 18 to 25%. So for a country to borrow money, they should never, even the worst countries in the world, they should never be paying a rate as high as 18 to 25%. But standard economic theory, it doesn't look at nominal interest rates that way. It just says, the real rate is what matters, and then inflation expectation gets anchored. But we don't know what's going to happen with inflation. So the nominal rate, people can make money from it if inflation rebounds. If it comes back down, then you'll make money with the high nominal rate. So I don't think central banks should try to play that game of guessing what's going to happen with inflation expectations or nominal. I don't think they should even play that game. They should just say, a logical real rate to borrow for a country would be, in the case of U.S., it should probably be never more than 3 to 4%. So like the highest central bank setting in a country like the U.S., unless our country dramatically changes and becomes completely unreliable, I don't think we should have interest rates ever above 3 to 4%. My paradigm would be to set the nominal rate as if it were the real rate. So, because currencies can rebound. But anyway, so this whole idea that central banks fight inflation is sort of problematic in the first place. And that's why we have fiscal theories, because you have to, with your borrowing and spending, with your taxing and spending, you have to have a budget balance to manage inflation. Now, some people like accidentally take contradicting views on this, but because if you say the limit on fiscal budgets is inflation, then that actually means you can spend massive deficits if there's not inflation, or if you aren't creating potential for future inflation. Anyway, so all that is great and interesting. Now, so if central banks kept interest rates a lot lower, things would be better. This is a ticking time bomb because in current theory, when inflation goes high, then they say rates high, and all of that interest that gets paid out on the national debt, that can, I mean, economists are aware of this potential, but they think it's a special case. They think they have this term called fiscal dominance. They think fiscal dominance is a special case. But I and many others don't really think it's a special case. I would, this idea that higher rates called inflation is generally called neo-Fisherism. Now there's all sorts of different people who talk about it. Everyone from Richard Werner to some MMTers say higher rates cause inflation, to more conventionally trained economists. Stephen Williamson is one of the big guys. I don't know much about him. I just know he's not associated with any of those other people. So neo-Fisherism is the idea that higher rates can fuel inflation. It has a broader sort of mishmash. You could almost say coalition, though it's not really a coalition because it's just people who agree on this principle but don't seem to agree on much else. But anyway, so all that's great. It would be nice if we didn't create this time bomb where when there's inflation we can trigger it worse and then really bad things can happen. If you look at the 1970s, this is what one might say what happened. We had massive years of inflation or stagflation because we were trying to use interest rates to fight inflation. When central banks, they don't even make sense to do this, which I talk about again. But anyway, the technical comparison I make is cars. They have a limited slip differential. So a differential is used in cars because you have to adjust power or the way that it drives different wheels. So the ratio of power going to different wheels. So if you're turning, then one wheel will travel further. So you want to put more power into the wheel that travels further. And then, so if one wheel's stuck, then you would put more power into the other wheel if you're turning. But what happens is if one wheel is in the air, then and you put more power into the wheel that's moving more freely, then it can just completely spin and all your power is wasted. Now that's sort of how I would describe what happens when you use this interest rate paradigm, when you're always trying to raise the nominal rate. You're just spinning your wheels. You're just putting the nominal rate higher and higher and higher, and it's not actually bringing inflation down. It's just fueling it, and there's basically no traction to bring inflation down. It doesn't end up restricting credit, any of that stuff. But that's all great. It's great if central banks knew how to do their jobs perfectly. It's cool that people have different ideas and interpretations, but we don't control that. We can't affect this. So what can we do as individuals? So that is where the idea of rate disparity comes in. We shouldn't expect all financial assets to return the same amount. And this is where you realize you have a certain power as a buyer of financial asset. And you can actually influence things to a degree that maybe you may not realize. When you're first getting into invest, well, as a retail investor, usually we're thinking about big companies. We just buy a small chunk, we're along for the ride. So it's a very passive mindset. But if you consistently buy something, if you consistently maintain something and improve it, that has a lot of power in and of itself. So this is often described as dollar cost averaging. So you consistently buy a small amount of the same thing. Now, I would even call this a way I describe this as negative dividends. So a dividend is a profit that you receive on regular intervals from owning an asset. Now, I would describe early as a dividend would be if it involves no effort on your part, it essentially becomes a negative tax. But anyway, if you are consistently putting work into an asset to help it and improve it, then that maintenance effort, it may look like it has a negative rate of return for a while, but you can be building up value. Now, it could also be a sunk cost fallacy. So it's not a perfect answer to everything, but if you want to build long-term value, sometimes you have to let things keep working through failures. Like they say in tech to fail quickly, but at the same time, there are certain things you want to keep working on, keep improving on. So you just keep plugging away, and eventually something will go exponential, something will go amazing. But there's no guarantees. I can't promise any of this will work. I just see that sort of attitude in almost these crypto communities where you aren't owning you don't have legal ownership of any real productive assets with crypto. You're just holding a token and hoping other people will want to buy it. It's almost culty like, and I don't necessarily like that aspect of it. I like the aspect where you could have a community built payment system, but I think it's massively under delivered in that regard as a payment system where you're holding the crypto not to try to get rich, but to like try to help support a way to build a community friendly payment system. So that's what I always saw as the potential for crypto. You wouldn't hold it to get rich, you would hold it to like because you cared about this community, and yeah, maybe the price would go up a little bit, but it was more so you could create a socially amenable payment system that didn't have high fees, that you could use easily online, that was just very friendly to end users, that wasn't like surveillance based and all this stuff. So I had way back in the day, I first heard about cryptos in 2012. I first bought crypto in 2000. I bought some like 300 in Bitcoin in 2018, sold for 360. So I was never super on the train but I wrote a lot about this stuff. But anyway, so the basic attitude is you just want to be consistent with whatever you decide to do. And you hear that a lot, but this whole idea of negative dividends, I have a certain way of viewing that with rate disparity, that not all assets, we shouldn't expect them all to have the same standard of financial returns. We should have a little conviction. That's all I'm saying. You can try a lot of things and fail, but at a certain point, you won't get very far until you have some consistency. So that's my advice. I think it's very interesting to talk about macro issues. It seems a little empty when it's not something we can directly control and something we can act on. So those are my thoughts. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a great day.